Shalom, everyone. I wanted to continue with the Davidic covenant, specifically, um, the second part of this video to really talk about, more in depth the details of the Davidic covenant. So, with that, what I did was I wanted to do a side by side of 2 Samuel 7:1-29 and First Chronicles 17:1-27. Each of these scriptures, they are a mirror image of one another. They talk about the covenant that the Most High made with David. There are some few variations and differences, but what I kind of wanted to do a side by side. I'm not going to go over each covenant. I'm not going to go over, word by word or scripture by scripture. I just want to kind of do an overview of the covenant, what was promised to David, how David reacted to it, and then I want to pick out some important components of the covenant. All right, let's take a look. So if we look at 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 1, and it came to pass when the king sat in his house, and Yahuwah had given him rest round about from all his enemies. And then First Chronicles 17:1-7, now it came to pass as David sat in his house, that David said to Nathan the prophet, Lo, I dwell in a house of cedars, but the ark of the covenant of Yahuwah remaineth under curtains. Okay, so variations a little bit, but basically the same thing. David's in his house, and then all of a sudden he starts to think about this thing. He starts to think about the house of cedars. If you go to verse 2, 2 Samuel 7:2, it says that the king said unto Nathan the prophet, See now, I dwell in the house of cedars, but the ark of God, or the ark of Yah, dwell within curtains. So David's having this realization. He's saying, I have this permanent house of cedar, and the Most High has to dwell in this temporary house. It was David's desire to build a house for the Most High, a permanent house for the Most High, a permanent dwelling place for the Most High. All right, we're going to talk a lot about what that looked like. All right. If we skip down a little bit, Nathan tells him at first to do everything that's in his heart. And then that night, he hears from the Most High. Nathan hears from the Most High. If you look at First Chronicles 17:5, it says, This is the Most High speaking, for I have not dwelt in a house since the day that I brought up Israel unto this day, but I have gone from tent to tent and from one tabernacle to another. So the Most High is basically saying I didn't have a permanent dwelling place. I haven't had a permanent dwelling place since that point in time. And I went from place to place, or tent to tent, and tabernacle to tabernacle. So the Most High is kind of questioning David a little bit as to, his desire to build this house and why now. Okay. And then if we scroll down just a little bit more, verse 17, verse 6, wheresoever I have walked with all Israel, spake I a word to any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to feed my people, saying, Why have you not built me a house of cedars? So at the time where he was dwelling with them in the tabernacle, and his presence was made manifest by the cloud in the day and the pillar of fire at night, he's asking at that point, why didn't you build this permanent house of cedars for me? Because you knew my presence was dwelling with you, and I was speaking with you, I was interacting with you at that point in time. Okay. Here's what the Most High says. If we turn to 2 Samuel 7:8, it says, Now therefore, so shalt thou say unto my servant David, Thus saith Yahuwah Shavaot, I took thee from the sheepcote and from following the sheep to be a ruler over my people Israel. So he's going back a little bit. He's just telling David what he brought him. He brought him from, you were caring for the sheep, I brought you to being a ruler over my people. Verse 9. And I was with thee whatsoever thou wentest, and I have cut off all thy enemies out of thy sight, and have made thee a great name, like unto the name of the great men that are in the earth. Okay, so he's letting David know, not only did I take you from that place, and I brought you this place, and you made you king over the people, that I've given you a great name. Verse 10, moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more, neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more as before time. So that's what he says in 2 Samuel 7:10. And then in 1 Chronicles 17:9, he says, also I will ordain a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them, and they shall dwell in their place, and they shall be moved no more, neither shall the children of wickedness waste them any more as at the beginning. Okay, so those two kind of parallel what his promise was for Israel. And at this point, this is nothing new. All right. He promised this to Adam. He promised this to Abraham. He promised this to Moshe. He promised this to everyone as we're moving forward. He's promised to give a place, a land for Israel, the land of milk and honey. He's made these promises. Okay, so this isn't new, but what he's saying is, I'm going to put them in a place, and they're going to stay in a place that's going to be a permanent place. I'm going to give them a permanent residence, and they're not going to have to move. All right, so if you parallel that, when you look at it, David wanted to give the Most High a place in which was permanent and he didn't move. The Most High turns around and say, this is what I want to do. This is my desire for Israel. So when we talk about a man after Yah's own heart, David, all right, had the same desire for the Most High as the Most High has for his people, which is interesting. So David had that same desire. And that's David was in tune with the Most High's heart. Okay, David was in tune with the Most High's heart. And that could be why Nathan said at the beginning, go and do all that's in your heart, because Nathan knew that David was in tune with the Most High. What Nathan didn't know at the time was the Most High was going to reject David for building his house. All right. And as we get into this, we're going to get into some script that really, we're going to get into some script as to why was he rejected? Why did the Most High reject David from building the house? Okay. So the Most High makes this promise to Israel. Okay. He makes this promise to Israel that they'll be in their land. They won't have to move anymore. They will be safe from their enemies. Okay. So he makes this promise. All right. So David's listening. All right. Let's go down. Verse 11. And as since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and have caused thee to rest from all thy enemies, also Yahuwah telleth thee that he would make thee a house. Okay. Verse 12. And when thy days be fulfilled, so he's speaking to David. He said, look, I'm going to make you a house, meaning I'm going to make you a permanent dwelling place. Now, this is where the promise switches from Israel back to David. This goes right to David. This is to David's house. He's making this specific promise to. All right, he's making this promise. Now, I'm going to build you a permanent residence. And when you think about that word permanent, and you're kind of thinking about, and it doesn't say permanent, but it implies a permanent residence, meaning an everlasting residence or an everlasting dwelling place. That's the picture that you need to have in your mind, that the Most High is promising the house of David a permanent residence, a permanent dwelling place. Okay, so this is where it veers off from Israel as a nation to the house of David. Okay. And when thy days are fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee. So he's going to set up his seed, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. Right? Verse 13, he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Okay? So he's going to build it. So first, he's going to take David's seed. He's going to establish his kingdom. He's going to build a house for his name, and he will sit, or he will establish the throne of that heir forever. Those are the things, those are the components that he wants to do for David. Right? He's going to take his seed, he's going to establish the kingdom, a house, and a throne. Okay? He's going to establish a kingdom, the house, and the throne. All right? So that's kind of the promise in a nutshell for the house of David. He's going to establish the kingdom through the house of David. He's going to establish his throne through the house of David, and that person is going to build the house. Okay, so that person is going to build the house. He's going to establish the throne, and he's going to establish his kingdom through David. Verse 14. And I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he could commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men. And we talked about this last time, that if we looked at Solomon, we could see where Solomon was chastised by men. But if we look at the Mashiach as the ultimate fulfillment of this prophecy, the Mashiach, although he was chastised by the wrath of men, or by the rod of men, he wasn't chastised for his own iniquity. He was chastised for the iniquity of the nation. Okay, he was chastised for the iniquity of the nation. All right. So, in a nutshell, we have the promise. Now we have the covenant that Yah made with David. Okay, we have the covenant that Yah made with David. And it's interesting because now, in this covenant, he's made it with a specific house. Okay? This would be like, remember, you have Israel as a whole, and then you have Judah as the southern tribes. You have Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, which consist of the southern tribes. And then within that, you have the house of David. Okay? He hasn't made a promise like this with any other house within the 12 tribes, okay? So this is special. This is unique. This is important, okay? This is very, very important what he just did. So what I want to look at is, let's look at the house, okay? Let's look at the house promise, because if he promised that he was going to build this house, what did this house consist of? Okay, and we know that David wasn't able to build the house, but what did the house that was finally built, what did that house consist of? So we're going to look at what that house consisted of and what was that house, okay? And then we also want to hear a little bit about some of the things that David told his son Solomon. So we want to see the fulfillment of the scripture. We want to see how the scripture is fulfilled. So let's first look at the house that Solomon built. All right. So we're going to turn to 1 Kings 6, 1 through 38. And we're going to also hold 2 Chronicles 3, 1 through 17. Okay, and each of those, we're going to be able to find out. It's going to tell us about the house that was built. Okay? It's going to tell us about the house that was built. There's an important aspect that I'm going to point out about the house. And it wasn't obvious to me until I started to really study what this house is supposed to be and what this house would actually look like. It wasn't that obvious. It didn't just pop off the page. It was something that I didn't realize, that the house and what the house was supposed to be. All right, so let's look at 1 Kings 6, 1. And it came to pass This is where we're at. And it came to pass in the 408th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of Yahuwah. All right, so we're talking about 408 years after they came out of Egypt. So 408 years after they came out of Egypt, in the month of Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build this house. Okay, and Second Chronicles 3:1-17 is the same thing. It's a mirror image of this story. It's a mirror image of Solomon building the house. If you look at Second Chronicles 3:1, it says, "Then Solomon began to build the house of Yahuwah at Jerusalem in Mount Moriah, where Yahuwah appeared unto David his father, in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Oman the Jebusite." Okay, so this gives a little bit more detail. So in 1 Kings 6:1, it tells the month when the house was built. In 2 Chronicles 3:1, it tells where this house was built. Okay, let's go on. 1 Kings 6:2. And the house which King Solomon built for Yahuwah was the length thereof was 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 20 cubits, and the height thereof 30 cubits. Okay. There's a reason why I'm reading the measurements. Verse 3. And the porch before the temple of the house, 20 cubits was the length thereof, according to the breadth of the house, and 10 cubits was the breadth thereof before the house. So, before the house is a porch. Okay, when you fast forward to the New Testament, it talks a lot about this porch. But before the house, before you could enter the house, you would come to a porch. Okay, let's go verse 4. And for the house, he made windows of narrow lights. That's verse 4. Verse 5. And against the wall of the house, he built chambers round about. Against the walls of the house round about, both of the temple and of the oracle, he made chambers round about. And let's talk about, okay. Let's go to verse 7. And the house, when it was in building, was built of stone, made ready before it was brought thither, so that there was neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron heard in the house while it was in building. All right. So here's what you have to picture. Right. You have to picture Solomon got specific instructions from David. Right. Solomon got specific instructions from David on how to build this house. David got those same instructions from the Most High. Those same instructions were given to Moshe when Moshe was setting up the tabernacle. Okay? Those very specific instructions. Why? Because this house had to mirror or shadow what was contained in the heavens. All right, so this house had to mirror that. So there was a specific building way, a specific way to build this house for the Most High. And we know the tabernacle that is in heaven, or the Shamayim, the tabernacle that's in the Shamayim was built without hands. All right. So you see here, it says, so that there was neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron heard in the house. Because it's mimicking that tabernacle that's not built with hands. And as we start to go deeper in what is this house, what is the tabernacle, are they the same things, are they synonymous? We're going to find out what the house is and what the tabernacle is. And then we're going to be able to find out that not only is he talking about the physical building, he's also talking about the spiritual tabernacle. He's talking about the spiritual house. Okay, so it moves forward as he describes this building. He's not only describing this building, he's describing what's contained in the heavens. So that's why it's important. So that's why the details are so very specific. And the details have to be that specific because they have to follow it to a T. Because if they're looking for a place for the Most High to abide, it has to mirror the place where he abides now. Okay, so they're looking for that place for the Most High to abide, so it has to mirror that place. If not, the Most High wouldn't abide there. All right, so it has to mirror that place. All right, so if we go down to verse 8, the door for the middle chamber was in the right side of the house, and they went up the winding stairs into the middle chamber out of the middle of the third, into the third. And it says, verse 9, so he built the house, finished it, and covered the house with beams and boards of cedar. Okay, so Solomon is building this house. So part of the promise was that your heir, David, someone out of your loins, would build me a house. So that's what's happening right now. Out of the loins of David, a house is being built. Okay, out of the loins of David, a house is being built now. So that is the establishment or the fulfillment of part of this covenant. All right. So now when you look at it, now you ask yourself, you say, wow, David had this desire to build a house. David had this desire to build a house, but he was denied. And then you say to yourself, well, I don't quite understand why is David being denied this pleasure. David's a man after Yah's own heart. David's done all these things. David has conquered. David's done all of these things. Why not David and why Solomon? Okay. Why not David and why Solomon? Because we know Solomon's end. Like we have the advantage of looking back at Solomon's end and say, wow, it didn't end well for Solomon. Solomon got into a lot of different things, and it really didn't end well for Solomon. And so we have that. We're able to kind of look back and really critique, and say, well, why didn't the Most High make this establishment without weed? Okay, so all right, I'm going to pull up. Let me go to Blue Letter Bible. Let's do that. Okay, let's pull up Blue Letter Bible. All right, and then we're going to go here. All right. So let's continue with, let's see. Where do I want to go from here? Let's go to First Chronicles. Let's go to First Chronicles 17. Let's go there. Let's see if that's what I want. Okay, well, I'm waiting for that to load. Let's see, First Chronicles. Okay. All right, so we're back to what the promise was for David. Wait a minute, is this what I want? Okay. I'm sorry, First Chronicles 23. Let's go to First Chronicles 23. Sorry about that. All right, so let's look at how some of this came about. Okay, so when David was old, so this is First Chronicles 23:1. All right, let's start there. So when David was old and full of days, he made Solomon, his son, king over Israel. And he gathered together all the princes of Israel with the priests and the Levites. All right, so David is old in age. He's up in age, right? So then David passes it down. It says, okay, I'm making Solomon the king over all Israel. Because you remember, when David's reign started, David started reigning over Judah. And then I believe he was reigning over Judah for 7 years. And then he started to reign over Israel. He started to reign over Israel later. So I believe he reigned over Israel for 33 years, where he had the whole kingdom. So it was Judah first. He had Judah first, and then he had the whole kingdom. So altogether, he reigned for 40 years. Okay, but it was at 7 years initially that he reigned with Judah, and at 33 years he reigned all of Israel. So he's giving this to Solomon. All right, so his heir is getting the throne. Remember the promise. The kingdom was promised to David's heir. So it's just following lockstep. We saw where Solomon, we kind of went forward a little bit where Solomon was building the house, which was part of the promise. Now we're going to the kingdom. The kingdom was given to Solomon. Okay. And let's go down a little bit. We're going to skip down. Let's see. I think I want to go to 20. I think I want to go to 24. Mm-hmm. Okay. Verse 28. First Chronicles 28:1. And David assembled all the princes of Israel, the princes of the tribes, and the captains of the companies that ministered to the king by course, and by the captains over thousands, the captains over hundreds, and the stewards, and all the substance and possession of the king, and of his sons, with the officers, and with the mighty men, and all the valiant men unto Jerusalem. All right, so David has everyone's assembled. David assembles everyone before him. All right, verse 2. Then David, the king, stood up on his feet and said, Hear me, my brethren and my people. As for me, I had my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of Yahuwah, and for the footstool of our God, or of our Yah, and had made ready for the building. So David's telling the assembly, he has everyone assembled together, all the leaders and princes of Israel are all assembled together. And he's telling them he had this desire to build a house. He had the desire to build a house for the ark of Yah. Remember, that ark represents his presence, okay? So when David's saying that he's building this ark for the ark of Yah, he's not actually building it for the actual construction. He's building it for Yah's presence, all right? Because Yah's presence was contained in that ark. So he's actually building this house for the presence of Yah, okay? And he's saying that he's making this is the footstool, okay? Now, you know the script where it talks about the earth being the Most High's footstool. David wanted to build a footstool for the Most High, okay? David wanted to build a footstool for the Most High. All right, let's go to verse 3. Elohim said unto me, Thou shalt not build a house by my name, because thou hast been a man of war and hast shed blood. Remember, we talked about Why didn't David get this privilege to build the Most High a house? David had too much blood on his hands. He was a man of war. David's job was not peace. David's job was to establish peace. Let me say that again. David's job was not for peace. David's job was to establish peace. Okay, that's what David's job was, to establish peace. To establish peace, obviously there was a lot of war that had to happen. All right, so the Most High told him that you can't build this house because there's too much blood on your hands. Okay, there's too much. You shed too much blood. All right. Let's look at 28:4. Howbeit, Yahuwah Elohim of Israel chose me before all the house of my father to be king over Israel forever. For he hath chosen Judah to be the ruler, and the house of Judah, the house of my father, and among the sons of my father, he likened me to make me king over all Israel. Remember, he gave a promise to Judah. All right. There was a promise that was given to Judah that Judah would be ruler. Okay. He gave that promise to Judah, and that's what David is going back. That's what David's talking about. David's talking about that Judah was promised to be a ruler. Okay. Judah was promised to be a ruler, and now David's house was given a specific promise. So he says, he chose me before all of the house of my father. So the house of his father is Judah, and to be king over, or the house of Jesse, to be king over Israel forever. Okay. He chose Judah to be the ruler, and the house of Judah, and the house of my father among the sons of my father, he likened to make me king over all Israel. So out of Judah, he drilled down from Judah, and he specifically pulled out the house of David to be the ruler. He pulled out a house from Judah, so it's not just Judah's going to rule. He pulled out the house of David and said that the house of David would be the house that ruled in Judah, or out of Judah would be the house of David. A lot of times you're going to find when he refers to the house of David, he refers to out of Zion, or he refers to Zion. Because remember, Zion is the city of David. All right. And when he refers to that, a lot of times he's referring to he's referring to the house of David. Okay. All right. Let's keep going. All right, let's scroll down a little bit. And all of my sons, for Yahuwah hath given me many sons, he hath chosen Solomon for my son, to sit upon the throne of the kingdom of Yahuwah over Israel. Now, David had many and many sons, because if you know anything about David, he had wives and concubines. Now, he didn't have them on the level of Solomon, but he had a lot of wives and a lot of concubines, right? So with that being said, since he had all those wives and all of those concubines, David had many sons. But just like it happened before, when Jacob had two sons, the line was chose, or I'm sorry, when Isaac had two sons, the line was chose through Jacob. All right, the line was chose through Jacob and not through Esau. What he's saying here is that he's saying that the line's going to go through the kingdom, is going to go to Solomon. Solomon was the chosen son, the chosen seed. So that was the chosen seed, was Solomon. Okay. All right. Let's just back up real quick. I want to back up real quick, and I want to go to Genesis 49:10. I want to back up real quick, and I want to just, what I want to do is I just want to look at the promise that was made to Judah. All right. So David talked about the promise that was made to Judah. If we go to Genesis 49:10, it says, all right, let's start at 9. It says, Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, and until him shall the gathering of the people be. All right, so even back then, when he is giving, when Jacob is blessing his kids, right, and he's telling Judah, he's giving Judah his blessings. What does he tell them? He tells them that the scepter, that the rulership shall not depart from Judah. Okay? What he doesn't tell him is that the rulership would come out of the house of David. All right? So that's the establishment of this rulership was through the house of Judah. The as this um as this prophecy, or as this promise was being fulfilled, that rulership specifically came out of the house of David. Nor a lawgiver between his feet until Shiloh come. We know Shiloh is the Messiah. Okay, so he's giving the rulership of Israel. He's giving it unto the tribe of Judah, but specifically the house of David. All right, let's go back to Chronicles. All right, so I just wanted to hit that point to make sure we had that point. Go back to Chronicles 28. Go back to Chronicles 28. Okay, what is going on here? All right, there we go. All right, so we're in the First Chronicles 28. Let's see, where do we stop off here? All right, so we talked about Solomon being chosen. Let's go to verse 6. And he said unto me, Solomon thy son shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. All right, that's part of that promise. So Solomon is fulfilling part of that prophecy. He's fulfilling part of that covenant, that Solomon is going to build the house for the Most High, and the Most High has chosen Solomon to be his son. Let's look. Verse 7. Moreover, I will establish his kingdom forever, if he be constant to do my commandments and my judgments as at this day. Now, we know the Most High made a promise to David that David's kingdom would have rulerships forever. But we also know in there he put that if you get out of line, that the rod of men would chastise you. Okay? So, same thing he's saying here. Yes, I've given this kingdom to you forever, but it's contingent on you following my commandments and my judgments, Solomon. And we will find, as we start to get more and more into this covenant, what happens to Solomon, what Solomon's judgment was for not following the Most High. Solomon was definitely judged, but Solomon had to go through a specific judgment for not following the Most High. Okay, that specific judgment was Solomon lost part of the kingdom. Okay, Solomon lost part of the kingdom because the promise was based on Solomon following the commandments and the judgments. Okay, let's keep going here. Now, therefore, in the sight of all Israel, the congregation of Yah, and the audience of our God, keep and seek for all of the commandments of Yahuwah your Elohim, that ye may possess this good land and leave it for an inheritance for your children after you forever. So, being that like, because we know the end of the story already, being that Solomon didn't follow through, then Solomon lost what was promised. Okay. So when you look at this, right, you say to yourself, we were promised something forever. We lost it for our disobedience. How do we get it back? How do we get it back? So when you say to yourself, why did the Messiah have to come from the loins of David? Okay. You might say that to yourself. You're like, well, why did the Messiah have to come from the loins of David? Because we needed to be redeemed by a kinsman. All right. In order for us to regain those things that we lost due to disobedience, we had to be redeemed through our kinsman. All right. Our kinsman had to come in and redeem us from slavery, redeem us from oppression, had to come in and redeem us. I'm not going to turn to Leviticus now, but if you read in Leviticus, it talks about the kinsman redeemer. So when we lost everything due to our disobedience, it takes someone from that same lineage to come about to restore those things that were lost. Okay. So it's important when you say the Messiah is the branch, it's important that the Messiah is the branch of, the branch of Jesse. All right. It is important that the Messiah is a son of David because he had to redeem. Who lost the kingdom? The house of David lost the kingdom at this time. Who has to restore the kingdom? Someone from the house of David. That's why it was important that the Messiah come from David's lineage. Okay. We can't simplify that point, or we can't suppress that point that we needed a kinsman redeemer. That's part of the law. That's how this had to come about. That's how restoration comes about through a kinsman redeemer. That's why you look at where we're at now. Where are we now? We're in America, right? 400 years of oppression, 400 years of oppression, slavery, subjugation, all of those things have happened. We need a kinsman redeemer to come save us out of this. Okay? I don't want to get too far ahead, but when you think of the 144,000, you think of the two witnesses, you think about those things. Why do they have to be out of Israel? Because we need a kinsman to come and help redeem us and deliver us. And the ultimate redeemer is going to be when the Messiah comes back to set up his kingdom. That's the ultimate redeemer. But there's going to be a redeemer or redeemers that help us leave this oppression and go to the wilderness, right? Remember, there's more than one Messiah. There's the Messiah, okay, which is Yahushua HaMashiach, but there's also other Messiah figures. Moses was a Messiah figure because he led his people out. He led his people from slavery to freedom. So Moses would be a Messiah figure, not the Messiah himself, but a shadow of what the Messiah would do. So it's very important that we have a kinsman redeemer redeem us, right? That's why when he talks about setting kings over us and all of these other things, he talks about not any other nation, setting another nation over you is transgression, because we're going to be redeemed from within. And that's why when you get the revelation and it talks about the 144,000, it talks about them in terms of being from the tribes of Israel. And they have to be, because we're going to be redeemed by our kinsmen. All right. So I wanted to hit that point a little bit before we moved on. All right. It says, and thou, Solomon, my son, know thou Elohim of thy father, and serve him with a perfect heart and with a willing mind, For Yahuwah searcheth all hearts, and understandeth all the imaginations of the thoughts. If thou seek him, he will be found of thee. But if thou forsake him, he will cast thee off forever. David's giving him the warning. David's saying, all of these things are promised to us. These promises are contingent that my seed do this thing, that my seed keep his commandment, that my seed stay in the way of the Most High. If my seed does those things, then my seed will prosper, and this promise will carry from generation to generation to generation. But if you don't do those things, then you're going to be cast off. Here we go. Verse 10, take heed now, for Yahuwah hath chosen thee to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it. Now, I want to look at this scripture very closely. Take heed now, for Yahuwah hath chosen thee to build a house. Baith, that's H1004, for the sanctuary, the Migdash. Let's look at what the sanctuary, let's look at that. And that's H4720. Sanctuary of the temple, of the tabernacle, the sanctuary is that holy place. So when you picture this, I want you to picture two things. I want you to picture that sometimes when we picture the house that's being built, we picture a house as being just the temple. But the house is more than a temple, okay? The house, inside of the house is contained the temple or the sanctuary. So Solomon is building this house, and inside that house is going to exist the outer porch, or the outer porch, the holy place, and then the holy of holies. Okay, but that doesn't encompass the whole house. The temple is not the whole house. There's a separation between the temple and between the house. There is a separation. Why is that important? It's very important as we talk about the law, and we talk about sacrifice, and we talk about what does that holy place encompass at this point. We're going to turn in a minute, we're going to turn to Hebrews, and we're going to read about what that holy place, or what it refers to, what is he actually talking about. But we have a house, which is the largest structure, and then within that structure is the temple, is within that structure. When we go to Revelation, we're going to talk about if the temple remains in the house. Okay? So Hebrews is going to kind of tell us where we're at this point after the Messiah comes, where we're at this point in reference to sacrifice, and reference to what his house looks like. And then Revelation is going to tell us when that ultimate house comes down from the Shamayim, when that ultimate house comes down, will there be a temple inside of that ultimate house? And why not? Because remember, this promise that he made to David, right? This promise not only involves the kingship, but it involves the priesthood of Melchizedek. It involves that also. It involves the new priesthood also. Okay? So not only are we talking about the kingship, we're talking about the priesthood, and we're talking about what the priesthood would look like. And when he talks about building a house for David, if we go back, this whole conversation happened after David was king, after David already had a house built of cedar. So the Most High wasn't talking about building David a physical house. Because remember, when David had offered to build the Most High a house, the Most High came back and said, no, I'm going to build you a house. David already had a house of cedar. But David didn't ask him any questions because David knew where he was going with that. He wasn't going to build David a physical house. He was going to build David a house in which the priesthood could be contained. Okay? I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but that was the goal of the Most High, to build him a house in which the priesthood and the kingship could reside in that same house. Okay? That's what the promise is. It's not, the promise is not the physical house that he was going to build David. It's the house that would contain the priesthood of Melchizedek and the kingship in one house. Or if you want to get specific, one body would contain that. Okay. Let's see. Are we going to stop here? Yeah. Well, I mean, the only other point that I would hit here in First Chronicles is that David, or not David, well, David gave Solomon the specific directions that we talked about. And as you read down, it talks about how David gave Solomon the specific instructions. Even the weight of the candlestick had to be a certain weight, if you look at verse 15. So he gave it for what the house should look like and what the sanctuary should look like, but he also gave for those specific elements that were within it. He gave Solomon very specific instructions on what that should look like. And remember, we said because he's building a shadow of what exists in the Shamayim. Okay, perfect. Now, let's go to Hebrews 9. Let's start to talk about the house and the sanctuary. What is this promise? And I think a lot of times we think this promise was we think that the promise was a promise for a physical house, and it was not. Hebrews 9. All right, let's take a look. Hebrews 9:1. Then verily the first covenant had also ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. Now, here we go. When he said to David, I'm going to build you this house, within the house is contained the sanctuary. We know under Moses, the covenant of Moses, the sanctuary was a physical, worldly sanctuary that he was building. His promise to David was not a worldly sanctuary. Okay, worldly meaning, let's look at that word worldly, just so we have the understanding of what that word worldly means as far when reference to sanctuary. Okay, yeah, my Greek is terrible. So cosmikos, that's G2886. And let's look at the definition of that word worldly. Of or belonging to the world. Okay, earthly, right? So Moses had an earthly sanctuary. Okay, Moses had an earthly sanctuary. So when we look at the establishment of the new covenant, and this is going to help us, this is why we have to understand David's role. We have to really understand the role of David, because when we look at this covenant that he made, right? When you look at the covenant Yah made, Yah had a specific direction for the priesthood, a specific direction for the sanctuary. Remember what I just said, that he wanted to make a house that could contain the priesthood and the kingship together. All right. So he talks about the first covenant and talks about the ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. That's a physical, earthly. For there was a tabernacle made, the first wherein was the candlestick, the table, the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. So the sanctuary had all of those different elements in there. Verse 3. And after the second veil, the tabernacle was called the holiest of all. So we have the outer porch, we have the holy place, and then we have the holy of holies. Okay. which had the golden censer, the Ark of the Covenant. When David was talking about the Ark of the Covenant being covered or being separated by the curtains, round about with gold, wherein was the golden pot that had manna and Aaron's rod that budded and the tables of the covenant. Okay, all of those things were in the ark. And over it, the cherubims of gold shadowing the mercy seat, of which we cannot now speak particularly. Now, verse 6, now when these things were thus ordained, the priest went always in the first tabernacle, accomplishing the service of God. So the service of Yah was obtained or was done through the priests going in and out of the first tabernacle. So that's doing the sacrifices for the people, sacrifices for themselves, the burnt offerings, first fruits, all of those different sacrifices were done in that sanctuary. Okay. But into the second went the high priest. So the high priest alone went into that holy of holies. Remember, the priest could only do those things in the holy place, and there was one high priest, and that high priest could only go in to the holies of holies once per year. Once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. He had to offer blood for himself because he had sinned, and then for the sins of the people, he offered that. All right. A Ruach HaKodesh, this signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest, while as the first tabernacle was yet standing. So, at that point in time, right, for anyone to get into the Holy of Holies, right, anyone couldn't get into the Holy of Holies. It wasn't made manifest for everyone. It was that one priest that one year could go in, and it might be someone else the next year, but it wasn't made manifest to everyone. That this Holy of Holies place wasn't made manifest. Remember, I want you to go back. The house that he promised David, he would have the priesthood in that house, and he would have the kingship in that house. I want you to keep going back to that. All right? Someone that can enter the holies of holies, but a king that can enter the holies of holies. So you have a king priest being able to enter the holy of holies or being that holy place. Okay, keep that in mind. Verse 9. Which was a figure from the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect as pertaining to the conscience. So we know these were outward gifts and outward sacrifices, right? They couldn't make you perfect in that when you made these sacrifices, they didn't really change you. All right, the changing of you was done through a different means. But giving these sacrifices every year and giving these gifts every year didn't necessarily change the person. It was an outwardly sign of what the Most High was bringing about. Okay. Which stood only in meats and drinks, and diverse washings and carnal ordinances imposed on them until the time of Reformation. So what he's saying is these meats and these drinks, these washings, these ordinances, he calls them carnal because they're earthly. These are earthly things. He doesn't, when he says, let's take a look, because I want you to understand what's happening here. All right. When he's talking about a shadow of things to come, he's talking about that these services to God, these things that we did were a shadow of what he was going to ordain. And he was going to use the house of David to do those things. All right. So look at that word carnal. That word is sarx. That's G4561. All right. And when we look up that word, flesh, the body of a man. Okay. used of natural or physical origin. So it's a physical origin of these things. These things are physical things, okay? So when he says carnal, a lot of people, when you hear carnal, you're hearing, you're looking at this second part. Sometimes you think about carnal, you're thinking about things that are against God or things that are, you know, like sin and things like that. But this carnal just means flesh. It just means physical. This physical carnality. Okay, this is the physical carnality of those ordinances were physical ordinances. That's what he's saying. That's all he's saying. All right, he's not making a judgment on them. Until a time of reformation. What does he mean, reformation? What is that word? What is he meaning there in reformation? Okay. That word reformation is, my Greek is terrible. That's G1357. Diorthosis. Diorthosis, in a physical sense, a making straight, restoring to its natural and normal condition. Something which in some ways protrudes or has got out of line or broken or mishappen limbs. Okay, now, when we talk about a time of reformation, we talked about a kinsman redeemer. He was going to bring those things back that were broken off from the tree. So, due to the sin of Solomon or the sins of Solomon, the kingdom was split into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And the rulership was lost. When the Messiah came, he brought reformation, meaning a restoration of that line, a restoration of those branches, a restoration of that house. He brought the restoration. So those physical things, right, were with us until the Messiah restored us back unto him. So those physical sacrifices, that physical thing, all of those things that we did, that our forefathers did, was until he could make a body that contained the priesthood and contained the kingship. That's what we were waiting on. Okay? That was the thing. When the Messiah came, he embodied the priesthood of Melchizedek and he embodied the kingship of David. He embodied both of those things, meaning that he could perform priestly duties. Because remember, up until this point, a king could not perform priestly duties. He could perform priestly duties, and he could also be a ruler over his people. That's what's happening here. That's what we're being led to. So when we talk about the house that the Most High promised David, and we talk about that house, and we want to know what that house was, because we know David had a physical house of cedar already that was magnificent. But when he talks about that he is going to establish his house or build a house for David, he is talking about the body of the Messiah. That's the house which is the descendant, or out of the loins comes from David. That house would be built as the embodiment of the priesthood and the embodiment of the rulership. That's the house he built. Okay. That house that he built for David, right, could stand in the Holy of Holies, right? That house he built for David could stand in the Holies of Holies. So he promised David a descendant or a house that would be able to stand in the Holy of Holies. So that's what we get out of this. So David's lineage brought forth that vessel that could stand in the holy place, the Holy of Holies. Because up in this time, there wasn't that access. But now we have a king and the priest that is in the Holy of Holies. Okay? That's the importance of this thing. And we made that distinction. We made the distinction between the house and between the temple for a reason. And we're going to get back to that. But there is a distinction between the house and the temple. And I don't know if I'm going to get back to it today. I might have to do a part 3. There is a lot. There's so much. This is so meaty. There's just so much content to go through. Because when you look at this on the surface, when you look at the promise, you're just saying, oh, he promised a house for David. Oh, he promised a kingdom for David. Oh, he promised, the rulership for David. He promised these things for David. All right, that's easy. But when you look in depth of what he actually did and why the Messiah had to come from David, when you look in depth and you figure out that the house that he built for David was the Messiah. The Messiah was the house that he built for David. That house is going to last forever. That house is going to be a ruler forever. That house is under the order of Melchizedek. That house that he built for David. And did David know this? Yep. Let's turn to Psalms 110. I know I'm kind of getting all over the place. But if we go further in Hebrews talks about how the blood of goats and the blood of calves couldn't make us perfect, and it talks about the blood of Christ. You know what? Here's what I want to do because I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Before I go to Psalms 110, and I want you to hold the thought about, did David know what the Most High was doing as far as building him a body to encompass these two these two objectives? We'll go to Psalms 110, but let's just finish this up real quick. Verse 11. But Christ being come a high priest of good things to come by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building. So what they're saying is Christ is not part of this physical representation of the building. He's coming from heaven. He's coming from the actual tabernacle that was built without hands. All right. So this physical or carnal a building that Moses used as a representation of what was happening, Christ comes from the actual real thing. Okay. Neither by blood of goats and calves, that's verse 12, but by his own blood he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. So unlike the priests had to do in the past, every year they had to go in with this blood and cover our sins. He went in one time with his own blood. And then he made our redemption possible with his own blood. So he's a priest. So when you look at this, you say, wow, he's a priest. He's a priest, but he only had to go in one time. He only had to go into that place one time. Verse 13, for if by blood of goats, of bulls and goats, and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean, sanctified to the purifying of the flesh. Okay, let's look at verse 14. How much more shall the blood of the Hamashiach, who through his eternal spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from the dead works to serve the living Yah. So what happened was he presented his blood, his spotless blood, to the Most High in the holiest place, in the real holiest place. He presented himself. That body that God made, that body that Yah made, that came from the stock of David, that body that Yah made, he presented it back to the Most High. spotless, clean, and he presented it back to him. And for once and for all for our sins. So now they're saying that blood that was shed, that blood that's contained in the Messiah, that's how we're changed. We're not changed by the blood of goats, the blood of calves. We're not changed by that. But our conscience can be changed or can be brought back from a dead place through this power or through this body. So we have to change our priesthood. And I really didn't want to, I'm really not trying to go there because I'm probably going to have to do another part. But we have to change priesthoods. We have to transition from the Levitical priesthood to the priesthood of Melchizedek. And the key to that is the house of David. David is the key. David is the key to making that transition. And that's why David brought the Ark of the Covenant to his tabernacle, because he was showing that transition of the presence from the Levitical to the Davidic. And the Davidic contains Melchizedek, which is the priest, and the rulership, which is David. All right, before we stop, I just want to go to Psalms 110, and I just want to hit this point. I'm definitely going to have to do another part of this. But it's good. It's good to just, to wrap your mind around the depth of what he was doing. All right, Psalms 110, and you probably heard this one. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make thy enemies thy footstool. Yahuwah said to David's Lord, that's the body. David knew that he was going to make a body or a vessel for him. So David's talking to Yah, saying, to my Lord, or the body that you're making for me, sit at my right hand until I make thy enemies thy footstool. Yahuwah shall send the rod of thy strength out of Zion. Rule thou in the midst of thy enemies. He's sending it out of Zion. So what does that mean? The Messiah, when the Messiah finally lands on this earth, he's going to land on the Mount of Olives. And then he is going to come and he is going to recompense. He's going to recompense all of the wickedness that's been done on this earth to us. He's going to land. So he's coming out of Zion. He's coming out of the heavenly Zion, yes. And he's landing on the earthly Zion, and he's going to go from there to recompense. Verse 3, thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power. So we, as the people, as the tribe, are going to be willing in the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning. Thou hast the dew of thy youth. So, the beauty of the holiness from the womb. So meaning that we will be set apart from the womb, what Jeremiah said, in that dawn, in the dawn of that day, will be set apart in the dawn of that day, and has to do with thy youth, meaning that we'll have the strength of our youth. Yahuwah has sworn and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. This is what David saw. David saw the priesthood. He saw the order of Melchizedek. He saw that he would create a body that could contain the priesthood, could contain the rulership, and that would be after the order of Melchizedek. And he saw that that would be a priest king. David saw this. David saw what was promised to him. David was promised this house. This is the house that was promised to David. So when I say the house was more than just the temple would signify the temple would signify the priesthood, right? Which is in the house, but the house represents the rulership. Okay, so that's why when I said before that the house was more than just a temple, it contained the sanctuary, it contained the temple, but the house represented the rulership, and the sanctuary or the temple inside of that house represents the priesthood. Verse 5, Yahuwah at the right hand shall strike through the kings in the day of his wrath, and he shall judge among the heathen. He shall fill the places with dead bodies. He shall wound the heads over many countries. He shall drink of the brook in the way. Therefore shall he lift up the head. This is the restoration. This is the restoration. When he says he'll drink in the brook of the way, when we revisit this, we will talk about the way of holiness and what that means, and who walks that way of holiness, because that's what he's referring to. And then we'll also talk when he says, therefore shall he lift up the head, meaning he's going to lift not only himself up as being the head over everything, the kingship, there's the kingship right there, but the head is us. We're the head and not the tail. He's going to lift up the head. We're going to go back to our original position, the position that he had planned for us. So with that being said, I'm going to stop there. Like I said, this promise to David, more than just, I'm going to build you a house. He was building David, and that building, that house that he spoke of, was the Messiah. He was building him or making for him a perfect representation to house the priesthood and to house the rulership. That was the house that he built for David. All right, I hope this was a blessing to you. Thank you so much for your attention. Shalom. Enjoy the rest of your day with the Most High. I pray that the Most High would bless your families, and I pray that the Most High would be with you. Thank you.